Welcome and thank you all for joining today's panel discussion with Nokia, Breaking Ground with BEAD, The Real Work Begins. Here to present from Nokia is Lori Adams, VP of Broadband Policy and Funding Strategy, and joining her from Winncom Technologies is our very own Head of Strategic Programs and Business Development, Alex Cernick. If anyone has any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to add them in the chat and they will be addressed. Alex, you're up.
Thank you, Dawn. As always, thank you for the excellent introduction. And good afternoon or good morning to some of you. Thank you again for joining us. It's been, I think, about a month since the last time we had our BEAD webinar series. And today I'm really excited to kick off a new discussion topic, and one that is arguably one of the most important topics now that is shaping our industry. It's the transition from BEAD planning to deployment. Now, as Dawn mentioned, we're joined today by Lori Adams. Lori is the Vice President of Broadband Policy and Funding Solutions at Nokia. She's been on the forefront of helping providers navigate federal and state broadband programs, and her expertise spans both on the policy sides and on the practical realities. And personally, she's been my phone a friend option since BEAD really started in 21. Just to kind of bring this full circle, Nokia has been a valued and a strategic partner of Winncom for about 3 years now, and one of the very first companies that really achieved BABA certifications. Now, since then, they've continued to lead the charge in making BEAD deployments possible. Now, while Nokia's portfolio is insanely broad, today the topics that we'll discuss will really focus on the fiber-based product solutions, in particular their OLTs, their ONTs, and IP routing portfolio. Now, together, we're going to dig into these solutions and how they fit the BEAD era and what providers can ultimately do to deploy smarter, faster, and more effective broadband networks. So we'll start this like we always do with a question and answer type of format. What I would ask is any questions you would have from the audience perspective, just add them into the chat, and at the end of this panel discussion, we can address everything individually. So Lori, to set the scene here, the BEAD application process is, with the exception of California, is finally behind us. So from your perspective, what does this shift from paperwork to deployment really mean for our industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time, right? And it's actually California and Texas will be announcing their awards later this fall. But in the last few remaining states, rest of the states, Utah, Florida, and Alaska are expected this week. So we are now finally talking, as you point out, something different. And it's a really critical time frame because there are currently still things happening between the federal, between NTIA and the states and providers. These awards are not final yet. There are haircuts happening. There are cost reductions happening as we speak. So as NTIA approves these final plans, we will expect to see some additional changes and cost reductions and possibly reduction in BSLs, which are the broadband serviceable location counts, and possibly the type of technology that's serving those locations. So we're still not final on all of that. That being said, at this juncture, if you're one of the, couple of hundred or more companies that has received a BEAD award, you should be thinking about what comes next and how to mitigate your risk. And and this should be going on while these last few things are happening and to finalize the grants. You should be thinking about executing your subcontract agreement, putting together your permitting packages, moving towards fine-tuning your high level design, your low level design, your bill of materials, thinking about how to get into that supply chain. So all of these things we're moving into that execution phase, and it's all going to happen very fast.
100% agree. And you said a couple things that resonate with me. Just to kind of paint a picture. So Winncom was heavily into the grant writing for the BEAD applications. top of my head, it was something like 30 customers, and we submitted 70+ applications. Now, right now, I think about 80% of those have turned into BEAD awards. But as you mentioned, one of the things that's happened almost with absolutely every single one of those sub-grantees is the tweaking of the BSLs. So a lot of the states came back and it wasn't a complete award, it was a partial version of it. So those same customers are now looking at tweaking or polishing their corresponding designs, redoing their budgets. And I think what that means for that next step is really from a supply chain and logistics perspective of being able to finalize the networking design. And then once that's done, reiterating that budget, putting together that entire scope, and then looking at the milestones that were communicated on the applications, the timelines, and building out what does that mean to me from a deployment perspective for FY26 Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. So more to come, I think, as we go through the panel discussions, but that's right now one of the biggest topics and the most conversations we're having. Now, from another question perspective, now, as you mentioned, there's a lot of states that have already communicated sub-grantees. I want to say it's like 35, 36, with more to come later this week. So now that they've announced their first awards, what are you hearing from providers? Are they actually ready to start breaking ground?
There's a mix of, I think there's a mix of responses. To your point, those that there's some shifting of, what that looks like based on whether they got most or all of their projects that they've been. I think in a lot of cases, people, did not get as much as they bid for. We saw some significant reductions from, those 3 states, Louisiana, Nevada, and Delaware, who issued awards in the back in the beginning of the year. Some of those companies that won the first time did not win the second time, and some that won the first time got a significantly much less serviceable broadband locations the second time around. So there's a lot of kind of regrouping happening. I think there's still a hesitation on the part of providers to move to do too much before the final approvals happen.
Yep.
But at the same time, as soon as those final approvals happen, the clock starts ticking for deployment. And so you have to be prepared to, green means go, right? The moment you get that final approval, it's go time, and it's going to be go time in 50 states, right? I mean, within a short time frame, every state is going to have to be, all the providers are going to be ready to go. So that's going to complicate things with locking down resources, with getting your, orders in to get into that supply chain, even if it's for 50% of what you might need while you're finalizing the BOM and the network design. So I still think there's still a little bit of a hesitation. I don't think companies are moving as fast as they should be moving.
I agree, and I'd say the key of what I heard there is still waiting for NTIA's final approval, but making sure all your ducks are in a row, so to speak. So if we're talking about a hybrid type of design, it's coordinating who's your fiber contractor and getting them up and running, and who's going to be doing your high-level, low-level designs, and who's putting boots on the ground, and the OSP engineering, and having that kind of ready to go. As soon as NTIA gets the state's final approval, you can hit that green button, or green means go, I forgot how you put it, but making sure you're ready. And then from a supply chain perspective, getting and working with distributors. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later on this panel discussion. But the key there, again, the more visibility, the more we can collectively plan together, the easier success will be. And then from I mentioned hybrid, from a fixed wireless perspective, a lot of this is, and I think we've mentioned it 2 or 3 times now, people didn't get exactly what they applied for. It's a percentage of it. So on the fixed wireless end, that means reductions in towers. If you're not going to have corresponding BSL locations, you can reduce your towers. So it's putting together the new designs, the new heat maps, putting together the new budgets. And then, as I mentioned, I think critical thing here is making sure that your distributor has the ability to aptly communicate with vendors, order products, and then from a supply chain logistics to be able to help you of when you're ready to actually deploy.
You know, and one thing to kind of jump in on is that if you look at the number of awards that have been handed out to individual companies, right? It's like 350 plus. I don't know what we're up to. I know recently the count was 350. If each one of those companies is doing their project in a vacuum, it's going to be very difficult to manage. Right? I mean, because you have 350 companies that are going to be looking to put in orders for fiber to secure construction vendors and resources to do projects that in some cases could be very small relative, to some of the bigger wins. So that could be tough to manage for a lot of the smaller awards, a lot of the smaller companies, and you need to think about how to achieve economies of scale, perhaps working with some of your regional neighbors and others to be more efficient, cost efficient.
Absolutely. So from your perspective, Lori, how big of a moment is this for digital infrastructure in the US? Do you see this as a true once in a generation opportunity?
There's been a lot of talk about that, right? This is the intention originally of the BEAD program. I mean, it depends on who you ask, right? Whether this was designed to close the digital divide. I know I was at a conference this summer where there was a panel of national folks in the industry, and they were all asked, do you think BEAD will close the digital divide? And they all answered no. I mean, it's relative to the time you're in, and the minute you draw a map at any point in time to say these are the locations that will be eligible for BEAD, and then you try to serve those locations, you will miss locations, right? Because we know that there are locations that just inadvertently were missed, some that were part of RDOF or other programs that then defaulted but missed the window to get into BEAD. So, I do think that this will go a long way to reaching these unserved locations that we've been trying to, reach for decades now. But at the same time, I think let's circle back in 5 years and see where we are. Did the BEAD program achieve its goals of closing the digital divide for those locations that it intended to serve? And I think the answer is TBD, but I think the trajectory of where this is going is that it's not probably going to achieve 100%. Somewhere between 75 to 100% is probably more realistic.
I 100% agree. So we've touched base a little bit on supply chain and deployment challenges. So from a supply chain challenge perspective, this has been around for a while. We saw it in particular with COVID. But as providers start ordering equipment at scale, what risks are you seeing? And what's the best way for subgrantees and our customers to stay ahead of those corresponding issues?
I would say the best way, and working with such a great partner like Winncom, is to work with distributors, right? Work with folks who can aggregate orders, who can manage supply across multiple projects to help mitigate the risk and keep the flow of the products going. I mean, the worst thing you can have happen, and this is, full disclosure, I directed the Maryland BTOP initiative 15 years ago. And I remember that there was a time where we ran out of handholds, and we had a sudden work stoppage that happened, and it was there were a couple of reasons why that occurred, and but you run the risk that construction crews will walk off the job if they're not kept busy. So you have to be able to mitigate for supply chain hiccups, for delays, for risks, for all those things, because the last thing you want to have happen is if you lose your construction crews because you can't keep them working. And so when you're starting these projects, you have to look at the end date and work backwards and say, you may have some wiggle room, you may have some buffer in there to complete everything you need to complete in 4 years, but chances are with the demand that's going to be put on the industry with projects happening across 50 states, not even to talk about what the hyperscalers are doing, right, on the private side, it is going to put a huge demand on our industry. And so you have to factor that into your execution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I almost think it's going to be very similar to when the restructuring happened on June 6th. From June 6th until really 30 days, 40 days later, depending on the states, it was a madhouse where you had almost all the states at the same time going through pre-qualification, going for application, and leveraging a lot of the common from our perspective, we offered grant writing assistance, we offered design solutions. So we had everyone kind of pulling from that same pool at the same time. So I think it comes down to that preparedness of the more that we can work together, the more that we can provide scalability, provide visibility, but the more we have a better understanding of the complete application when you're looking from a quarterly basis to do these implementations, the better we can stock, the better we can stage, the better we can site kit and deliver on site and perform all those different value added services. So again, visibility will be key, and I think it's one of the things that we will keep on coming back to in this panel discussion. Now, Lori, from Nokia's side, how are you preparing to handle the surge in demand while still staying ahead with BEAD's BABA compliance rules?
Yeah, I mean, so the Buy America, I think across our industry, right, not just specific to Nokia, but across the industry, the Buy America manufacturing has not been tested, really, right? Because primarily the 72 manufacturing locations that were certified by 45 companies were designed to do that for the BEAD program. Now, it was designed also, I will say, to support a much larger BEAD program. And what I mean by that is where, originally there were somewhere around 12 million locations that were unserved. That is what we were looking at when NTIA made the dollar allocations to the states for BEAD. And since that time, we've taken locations off the table because they were part of other funding programs. They were part of RDOF. They were part of CPF programs. They were part of ARPA programs. They were part of Reconnect programs. They were being reached by private equity. They were being reached by other sources of capital. We are now at a juncture where it looks like the number of BSLs that are going to be allocated BEAD funding will be somewhere around 4 million. With 44, 45 states data already in, we're just a little bit over 3 million locations. So that is a significantly smaller program. And some of those locations are going to be served by satellite, which is exempt from the Buy America requirements. So the scale is smaller. That being said, it's what we do as a manufacturer all the time. We scale to meet the demand as a global manufacturing company, and so we have been, looking at demand planning based on all the data we have. And so, Nokia, we'll be able to meet that demand. But I think as an industry, the Buy America chain has not been tested, but also it is a much smaller program than what was originally envisioned.
And then I'd be remiss if I didn't make this comment. One of the rules that are associated to these deployments is, let's say that when you're applying for the applications, you're specifying a technology code. So that technology code, essentially, it dictates what you're putting in. Is it fiber? Is it fixed wireless? Is it coaxial? Is it satellite? However, you are able to migrate within those technology classifications. I can't move from fiber to fixed wireless or fixed wireless to satellite, but I can move within the technology code themselves. And what I'm getting at here is we do expect to see very large supply chain disruptions across the board. And what that would mean is, let's say that you're putting in a competitor product. Let's say it's a Calix or an Adtran, and they do suffer major delays. And part of what you're responsible for is what you've communicated to the state from your milestones, from your timelines. And you could be negatively penalized for not achieving or meeting those predetermined criteria dates. So with that said, Nokia is primed and Winncom is primed here to help by being a stocking partner of Nokia Solutions, where we can help fill in these gaps. So again, work with us closely, constant conversations, but we can help from a host of different perspectives. So from a distributor's perspective, there's always challenges for inventory, staging, kitting, just-in-time deliveries. Just wanted to take this opportunity to provide some advice of what we want to communicate to potential sub-grantees. So because speed and cost and control are usually getting pulled in opposite directions, from our experience, that the providers who manage this balance best are the ones who build structure into their supply chain early. And we've really kind of hit on this several times in this panel. So before the shovel even hits the dirt, that means thinking about inventory, staging, kitting as not a one-off task, but part of that project management process. So at Winncom, we've seen how simple things like consolidating shipments or pre-labeling and pre-kitting or adding firmware updates and delivering on site when and where you need it really simplifies this. So just-in-time delivery also has its place, but all this only works if you have true visibility into the projects. And again, I mentioned that Excel version of looking at your total application, building it out per quarter, but we've also have some advanced tools. We've got project management tools that will provide you ultimately more visibility into individual orders and shipments. But this program helps to align us. It helps to ensure that we have the ability to see exactly what you need. That way we can stage with vendors like Nokia, we can stage on the OSP ends with BABA certified products like AFL, where we can put together these entire eco centers. Now, one of the things that we haven't talked about is supply chain compliance rules. And now every state, it works a little bit differently, but we have third-party programs and suppliers here that can help you really understand how do you need to communicate to the states. So if I made up an example, let's say Ohio, if you were one of the Ohio subgrantees that won, you got paperwork that was 55 pages that kind of set some of these stipulations. Now, they still need to communicate things of how you're actually going to submit and what that process looks like, but they're using, I think, Salesforce as one of their tools. So one of the things we do here is every vendor that we've talked about in these host of these BEAD panel discussions is either BABA certified like Nokia, or if it's on the fixed wireless side, they fall under that waiver wire. So we provide those certification letters from each one of those corresponding vendors. And it might not just be the active side, it could be the infrastructure side. There's a DOC de minimis waiver. So if you're talking about infrastructure or site support, those products also need those verifications. And that third-party company I'm talking about has a multi-tiered option, but we can use them as a teaching tool to, if you're going to do some of this stuff internally, repurpose stakeholders, hire new employees to manage the compliance side, we can help teach you what that process looks like at each individual state, which will differ slightly. So again, key here, I would say, is visibility and then leveraging us for our expertise and allowing us to really help you walk through this entire life cycle from start to finish. So shifting gears to scaling deployments, Lori, scaling quickly without losing quality is absolutely tough, especially in rural or hard to reach areas. what strategies do you think work best? And do you see smaller awardees teaming up with other STEM grantees as a good path forward?
I'll take your first question or second question first, and I'll say yes. I think if it makes sense and if it's logical, yes. I think it really does help to sort of resource share and scale, working with a couple of other partners to scale. The second thing is, it's all about preparation, but also I think grant-funded programs, and I've had this conversation a lot over the last couple of years, grant-funded projects work differently because you have a deadline, right? You have a finite date and time in the future when you have to meet, complete your project according to all of the requirements and all of the things that you've bid. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, some of the applicants bid more aggressively than the 4-year timeline, right? So 4 years was what's required by law, but some pulled that back and said, oh, we're going to do this in 2 years or 3 years because we can, and it'll get us more points, or it'll be more advantageous, we'll be more shovel ready. So that in mind, you don't have the luxury of looking at this in a linear fashion, right? It's not, first you do your environmental study, then you work on your permitting and engineering, then you do your, then you put in your orders for stuff, and then you start building and etc. If that is your linear plan, then you're not going to meet your deadline. You have to be working these streams simultaneously. You have to be doing what you can do up front while you're working that environmental process. So you've got to work the environmental process, start working on putting in your top line permits that take the longest to get approval. You've got to start putting in your orders for materials and supplies so that you have them in 6 months or a year when you start breaking ground and building. So all of these things have to be happening in a simultaneous stream as opposed to a linear one in order to execute within the boundaries of the project requirements.
I like that. I'm actually going to use that as my next marketing campaign. That's very well said. So shifting gears for a second. So labor shortages are known bottlenecks in this space. So how should subgrantees be thinking about workforce deployments as part of that overall strategy?
This is one where you really could collaborate with other BEAD winners in order to keep teams of construction crews working nonstop between multiple projects. Because the minute, if you have a small project, you're not going to get the attention that a bigger project will get in terms of responses, right? If you're put out an RFP, if you try to secure your resources and you find that you're too small, or your timeline doesn't line up with what their work schedule looks like, you're going to have a hard time finding crews, and then it'll get more and more expensive for you. So the more you can tap into what other projects are doing in your area, the better off you will be, particularly on the construction side of things. Because construction companies think in terms of regionally. How can I keep crews working within a region? It's more cost effective for them. They don't have to move heavy equipment from one end of the state or interstates. So those are some of the strategies that I would do. I know early on some of the states really were trying to say, look, for BEAD projects, we want you to tap into our state. We wanted you to use workforce in our state. And I just don't think that that's realistic. It's just, this is going to be a high demand occupation, a high demand across 50 states. And it's going to get very expensive. And there's going to be a huge push, huge demand for that workforce.
Yeah, and I think you said it earlier that one of the things we really need to watch out for is just having those construction companies sit idle. So one of the things I'm suggesting to customers, in particular the ones where their BEAD application was scaled down, is two things. So BEAD money can only be applied for what's in your grant and what's in your budget, but you can also use this as an opportunity to refresh your existing customers, your existing network. So network retrofitting. So when we're talking to customers, and this comes up day after day, we're finalizing what the BEAD deployments are. I go back to that Excel example of really redoing the design, coming up with what is your final bill, and then how are you going to build it. But then we have a separate look of, do we want to retrofit part of my existing network? Are those customers at risk for a potential other subgrantee come in as a BEAD funded overbuild in areas you didn't build? So again, looking at that perspective. And the others are, if there are natural extensions into areas you didn't bid, or areas you maybe bid but lost that someone else picked up, take rate is not guaranteed with these BEAD projects. So being more strategic and potentially looking at areas that make sense to you as expansion opportunities, we can help with private equity funding. We've got a host of programs that we can offer that would help you expand into those areas or protect those infrastructure assets that you already have existing within your network. And again, it all starts with those consultations. So if you're on the line and you're hearing this, if any of this resonates with you, what I would recommend is just drop a quick note in chat, and we'll reach out to you to have a more in-depth one-on-one consultation. But from a engineering, design, even from does it make sense monetarily and financially for you, we can help you build out those models. And that's all part of what Winncom offers from a value-added perspective, that true consultative experience.
And just to piggyback, Alex, you made a good point, which is that the BEAD project is a finite thing, but that doesn't mean it's the sum total of your project or of your expansion plans or your building, right? It just could be a smaller piece of it, particularly for those folks that bid on a larger territory and didn't get that. Well, are you still going to be looking to build in that larger area, but just under your own, a different funding source? So I think, the more you can aggregate, the better off you are, for particularly on the construction side of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I mentioned this previously, but a lot of providers that we've worked with at Winncom are working on both fiber and wireless. So those hybrid types of approaches, the hybrid builds. So I just wanted to kind of share a real world example of what this would kind of look like really quickly. And it kind of reiterates what I just previously mentioned. So I used Ohio as an example. We'll use that again. So Ohio was one of the states in particular that had a lot of hybrid wins, had a lot of satellite wins too. But in this particular example, the customer, the subgrantee, didn't get all of what they're looking for. So let's say that we applied for 13,000 BSLs and we ended up with something like 10,000. So what those conversations look like now is replotting the 1 BSLs and taking a look at what we communicated from a fiber and a fixed wireless perspective and figuring out what still makes sense. And if we're talking fixed wireless, and I mentioned this previously, it could be reduction of some infrastructure. So as we put these things together, we take all of the tower locations, GPS locations, and we've got programs here that do 2 really important things. One, they'll provide heat mapping. With that heat mapping, it will also do a best server analysis. And then we can also look at the RSSI associated to each one of these BSL locations. So we redo that again, and we essentially try to eliminate base stations if possible, towers if possible, but those reductions, we try to trim up that budget. That way we've got a final deployment that makes the most amount of sense. Same thing could be true on the fiber side. We've got some really interesting programs that will do AI rendered high-level designs where we can look at optimal paths to the network. So as we have these changes, we can go back and look at what makes sense? What does my core network look like? What are my drop locations based on these new BSLs that we were awarded? And then in addition to that, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's looking at existing networks and potential expansion opportunities. So putting all that together, we can really help you create the best approach. And then once we have that, we break this into individual detailed bill of materials, run this through our project management programs, and then we can ultimately help you. As Lori mentioned, we don't want to do this linearly. So if we're talking fiber, it's environmental, it's working with your pre-engineering company to do those low-level designs, putting boots on the ground. If you're doing aerial, burial, it's taking a look at that, looking at the right-of-ways, looking at what your supply chain needs to look like from your deployments, coordinating with construction companies. So we can help you walk through this every step of the way. That way we can ensure that when we're ready, again, product is there, it's available, and there's a host of site kitting configuration options that we can offer that really makes this experience simple. And that's one of the things that Winncom has been really good at doing, is taking complicated, streamlining it, and making this a simpler process for you. So again, I mentioned, if this resonates, reach out and we'll have those one-on-one conversations to figure out how can we collectively best service you, to put you in the best position to be able to achieve those timelines and milestones that you specify to the states. So from a compliance perspective, BEAD comes with really strict timelines and compliance rules. What are the biggest pitfalls, Lori, that you've seen, and what can we do when avoiding reporting, tracking, to make sure that we're staying aligned with those NTIA requirements?
Yeah, I think from the outset, right, you have to be, it all comes down to planning, right, and execution, and making sure that you're not shortcutting anything. And what I mean by that is, making sure that you're collecting the right data from the very beginning. You don't want to have to go back halfway through your project and find that there's data points that you should have been collecting from day one to help you with those compliance and reporting metrics and measurements and things like that. So, preparation was at 99% preparation, 1% perspiration. And, this is what you can be doing now while you're waiting for that final approval, is looking at your execution plan to make sure that you're tracking what you need to be tracked. You have a plan for that. You have, understanding all of the compliance requirements properly that go along with everything, so that you won't get stuck trying to recreate things that you should have been doing all along. And so it's, there's a lot to a grant funded project and to execute properly. And now is the time to start really focusing on those details. There's a little bit of shell shock, I think, with some folks, like, oh, hey, yeah, we're all in. The focus has been on the application for so long, on applying, on reapplying, on what the requirements are. And it's like, okay, now you have to kind of shift that mental gear to actually, what do you need to execute in the most cost-effective, efficient way, and manage all of those compliance requirements at the same time.
And then just from a Winncom perspective, at the most basic aspect of this, and any vendor that we've specified in the design, any vendor that we will provide those supply chain logistics services for you, we have all their compliance information. So as we put together the bill of materials, we will work with each vendor to provide that for you, which you then will upload into the portal. And then, as I mentioned previously, we've got a third-party provider that will do postal work compliance framework. And we've worked with them to build out really a 3-tier model. And at the very basic end of this, it can be a training perspective. So in your individual state, excuse me, what's required? How do you submit? Through what portals? How are you collecting invoices? What needs to be specified? So we can use this partner to help build and get you up to speed on what these individual components and requirements are. And then the second and the third tier are they can even submit things on your behalf. They can provide monthly audits to make sure that you are compliant. So depending on your familiarity with these programs, one of those three really can help you streamline the process and really make sure that you're getting paid on time and that money is not getting pulled back. So we know providers can substitute alternative products as long as they stay within the same technology categories. And I mentioned that previously. But Lori, from your perspective, how does Nokia help customers navigate those shifts? And what does that flexibility actually look like in practice?
I think, you know, it's obviously it's making sure that you have the right products to begin with, making sure that, you know, all of your products for at least on the fixed network side are BEAD compliant, BABA compliant, and that you're building that into the plan from the very beginning, really. I mean, it's just making sure that you understand all of the different requirements. I mean, there's just been so much noise, you know, and by noise I mean just data and information coming from the federal government, right? Whether it's and there's still a lot of confusion around the different Buy America, Buy American requirements, what's exempt, what's not exempt, where does that stop? I mean, we've had a lot of questions around, you know, the definition of a BEAD project and the notion that you actually cannot circumvent the BABA requirements no matter how you slice it, right? You can't, if you're putting in matching funds or you're paying for it out of pocket, it still has to be BABA compliant as long as it's part of your BEAD project. Anything that is part of your OLTs, line cards, optics modules, or you know, have to be BABA compliant. We've heard some folks say, you know, over the course of the year, well, we just won't put that into our budget. We're just not even going to put that into our budget. It does not matter. It has to be BABA compliant if it's part of a BEAD project, and you will be deploying it as part of your BEAD project. And so there's a lot of education that we've had to do. And you know, the information and resources coming out of NTIA have been, you know, they haven't really changed since the waiver was first released and since those FAQs were first released. And so there's a lot of questions. And you know, and another one is, you know, regarding the ONT, where does a BEAD project stop? And it's like anything that is downstream of an ONT is outside the scope of a BEAD project, meaning you can purchase those items, but you're doing so at your own cost. They're not part of your BEAD project. So there's a lot of education that's still happening with this, and that's really where we're, you know, filling in a gap, trying to make sure customers understand how these rules work and what the rule set is to be compliant.
Absolutely, absolutely. So if you could give BEAD awardees one piece of advice as they move from planning to breaking ground, what would that be?
I mean, I think, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's all about that, making sure your workflows are simultaneous and you're maximizing your time, because it will take time for you to get all of your materials and supplies, to lock in your construction vendors, but you can't do this in a linear fashion. If you will, you'll fail. You have to be working these streams simultaneously and doing everything you can do while that environmental assessment process is moving towards completion. So, you know, this is just, it's about being efficient. It's about understanding the dynamic and making sure that, you know, you work backwards from that end date and make sure that you're hitting all of your targets.
Absolutely. So if looking ahead 5 years, what do you hope this historic investment will achieve for digital equity in the US? And here's I guess, almost $1 billion question in some cases. What happens with the funds that go unused?
That's becoming the third rail of BEAD politics right now, right? I mean, because we're probably the states are going to spend for BEAD, for the construction aspect of this, less than half of the $42.5 billion. I mean, that's the trajectory we're on currently. So to your point, what are we doing with the other half? The other 60% or whatever it ends up being? And statutorily, those are legally obligated to the states as part of the BEAD program to be under the guise of non-deployment funds. And then the question becomes, what can a state do with non-deployment funds? There's a lot of folks that have talked about using that investment to support middle mile infrastructure, to support data centers and AI. I think that would be a really productive use of those funds. There's another set of folks that think that money is going to be taken and refunded back to the U.S. Treasury. We will see, which way this goes, but there's been a lot of conversation the last few weeks in the news as these BEAD programs are moving forward. Okay, that's the BEAD piece. What about the non-deployment piece? And that is a big TBD. But I think it would be a best case scenario to be able to reinvest that money into desperately needed middle mile infrastructure and other infrastructure to support scalable technology solutions that are coming down the pike.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And then I would also say, just to add on to that, is just to keep an eye out, because there are other grant and funding vehicles with some of the states. And you referenced middle mile. There's one that's happening right now in Texas, where there's $250 million available for middle mile infrastructure. And the premise is either fiber or fixed wireless, developing middle mile assets that others can leverage with some of these BEAD programs. But again, work with Winncom, we can help identify some of these grants, and we can, from a design, engineering, and grant writing perspective, really bring you from start to finish and bring you full circle. So again, if you have any thoughts, any opportunities, drop a line in the chat and we can reach out to you individually. So I know we're coming to the end of this. One final question I have on my end, Lori, and for everyone listening today, in your opinion, what's the single most important action that someone could take right now to set themselves up for success for BEAD?
It would be preparing an order for materials and supplies. And I don't say that tongue in cheek as a manufacturer in this space with a vested interest in this, but I say that as someone who is seeing the demand across all of the materials and supplies that is being put on the industry by the web scalers and by data centers and AI infrastructure. And so, the BEAD universe is competing with that demand. And so the sooner you can get your foot in the supply chain door, the better off you will be. The longer you wait, the bigger your problem will become.
And I would say engage us early. Our job, and I mentioned this a couple of times, is to streamline this process and to really help simplify it for you. So as you're doing this, you've got a partner here with Winncom. You've got a partner here with Nokia that will help you take from award to implementation. And again, if it involves planning or re-engineering your network to optimize your final BSL or CAI counts, if it's then working with or needing recommendations for pre-engineering companies or fiber contractors that are either local into your particular state, your particular region, or some with national footprints. It could be something as simple as really looking at your bill of materials, breaking that into quarters, and then creating ways for you to aptly be able to see what that process looks like. But working with us, again, will help you through this process from start to finish. So I know we've talked a lot about different things, but simply said, you've got two partners on the line here that are here to help. So let us know where we can start. Again, most of these things they start with consultative conversations, but if you've been awarded, we've got programs for you. If you applied and you lost, we still have programs, from independent funding vehicles to leasing programs. But BEAD did identify areas that are unserved, that have less than 100 megabits per second. So we can work together, be more strategic on our outreach and targeting programs, but we can help you build out those strategies. And then again, if you need to retrofit your existing infrastructure, the key here is, even if someone has funding for a customer in your area, a happy customer isn't going to convert. And as long as you're providing them with quality service and capacity, the likelihood they're going to switch services aren't there. And again, BEAD doesn't guarantee a customer conversion or a take rate. So again, engage us early. Let us work with you throughout this entire process. And no matter where you are within that, BEAD awarded, BEAD lost, or wanted to build out your network, we've got a program that makes sense. Lori, anything you'd like to add last before we see if there's any questions?
No, I think that's you hit it. I think we got it all there.
Awesome. Dawn, I know you've been looking at questions. Is there anything out there?
It looks like you pretty much covered everyone's questions.
Fantastic. I like when I do that. Again, I said we make it easy, make it simple. So I want to thank everyone for their time. We certainly appreciate it. And again, I'll mention, if any of these things resonate with you, reach out. We'll have a follow-up email that will go out tomorrow. It will have a recording of this, but we'll also include contact information. So let's start with a conversation of, where are you within this process, and what can we do to enhance this for you, or help you push or look into a different direction. And as always, Lori, you are a wealth of knowledge, and we certainly appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, Alex. It's always a pleasure to be on a webinar with you guys and work with you. So
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and until next time.